Hello, welcome to Tampa Talk with Mary. Just wanted to drop in and say, I know that I'm editing the episodes, and something with season 2 improvements that I'm gonna work on is I need to stop saying like so much. I say it so much, and I didn't realize how annoying I was to everyone that heard my voice. So this is my formal apology. I do that when I'm nervous, I think. So when I'm meeting with someone really cool or someone who's really nice, I fill in the gaps because I think that they're going to get bored with me or they don't like me. I'm always predisposed to assume that they just don't like me right off the bat. Which is, working on that in season 2, all self-love and improvements. But I'm going to work on it. I'm going to stop saying like so much and, suck it up, buttercup. It's all good. Anyway, check out this episode of Tampa Talk. Yeah, because normally when you put the mic out in front of people, that's something that's like... and then no one really wants to talk anymore, but it's like we had this great conversation before while I was sitting up, and then they're just very quiet. But anyway, hello. Welcome to Tampa Talk with Mary. Welcome to the show that only airs once a month. Quick story. So I'm just going to borrow the same story I had mentioned in the last episode. I have had to remove a tampon from me in public twice. Oh. So before I went to do my interview last week with Professor Elizabeth Cramp, who we had on the show, I was in my car and I started feeling dizzy and I had a tampon and I was like, why am I? And I was like, I had it in for too long. And I was like, well, and at the time, the building wasn't open for me to go into a bathroom or anything. I'm like, oh, shoot. So while I was in my car, I pulled it out and found a receipt and wrapped it and threw it in the dumpster. And that's the second time that's happened, not even the first. One of my finer moments. Yeah. But anyway, I'm really happy to have our other guest on the show, Professor Bonnie Curtis. Hello.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, as you said, I'm a professor here at, I'm an adjunct professor of theology at John Paul the Great Catholic University. And I have my master's degree is in biblical theology, and this was a later. I only went back and got my master's degree after I'd already raised my family, and I just started decided when my youngest went to high school, I thought, okay, what do I want to do now? And I decided I wanted to study theology, and so I went back and took philosophy for a couple of years, and then got my theology degree with no real intent to what I was going to do with it, other than it's my passion. And so it's kind of fun that it's led to an unexpected sort of second career. My first career actually is as a homeschool mom.
Wow.
So I homeschooled our kid. I got married young, and we have 5 kids, and I homeschooled them up till high school. So anyway, so that's how I got to where I am, and it's really fun to be with this dynamic group of interesting students at JP Catholic. So. And
it's all of your. Well, I met your one daughter because she came to.
Oh, that's right, our oldest daughter, yeah.
And that all of your children are super smart, or a doctor, or in the Marines or something. They've all ended up
they're
well.
all.
So
yeah,
that's really great.
Yeah, I was saying they've all had. A lot of them have had some remarkable academic success, but they're all pretty academically successful. But some of that just stemmed from my own insecurities as a young homeschooling mom, and so afraid of leaving anything out that I kind of overshot a little, and I was probably drove them a little harder than and myself than needed to be. But anyway, they're off doing their own thing, which is great to see them.
Yeah. And I guess it's not much of a segue, but I like how I just shared my horribly embarrassing story. I do invite every guest to share a tampon's terror story. I don't know if you had, it could be either a pad problem or a diva cup dilemma, whatever that may.
I was, and this is probably because, where I am now, my most traumatic one, well, I was a gymnast in high school, so there's all sorts of, awkward stuff with that. But thinking back, my biggest terror was actually with my daughter. So one of our daughters, her very first time that she got her period was while she was at her first horseback riding lesson. And just watching her, I had tried to, as a mom, I had thought about like how this moment would be, and I'd already talked to her, and I had all these visions of just this, we'd be at home and we'd be hugging each other, and we'd be talking about, beautiful sort of natural law, things. And she was very reserved and shy and very easily embarrassed in public situations often. And so this was like her worst possible scenario, that she was out in public and that they stopped the horseback riding thing, and she, and it was just, it might have even been more traumatic for me than it was for her. I have not talked to her about it since that day. Oh, gosh. So she may still be traumatized about it, but I think watching your daughter go through a traumatizing, moment like that. So that was, obviously no pad, no tampon. So I don't know if it qualifies as that, but that's the one that kind of sticks out to me, just because it's this, boy, it's something major that we have to deal with that other people don't. And with 3 of my daughters in the military, there's just all sorts of things that they have to think about that their male counterparts just don't.
Yeah.
So
that's that's a whole side tangent going into the military, but I couldn't even imagine.
Yeah, so anyway, that's what came to my mind.
I also probably would, if I was her, I'd probably never ride like a horse again. We'll connect that incident to riding a horse.
That's right. Oh gosh.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and oh gosh, yeah. So how many daughters? Do you have one daughter? How many daughters?
I have 3 daughters and 2 sons.
Oh, okay.
So it's every other one.
So when did this conversation of, because this is off our little thing, but the conversation of menstruation and periods and things, did that come up with your sons as well as your daughters, like having that conversation?
I think I don't remember talking to our sons about it, although growing up in a house of, especially they're homeschooled, so everybody's all together, and they, so as the boys, they're surrounded by it. So it goes, it's girl, boy, girl. So the boys are all mixed in with the girls. And then what we had, because this is one of these things that they don't tell you as parents, is like how to talk about these things with your kids. Particularly because my mom talked to me, that one time, and anyway, and it's hard to know how to do this. So we had these little pamphlet books of how do you talk to your daughter and how do you talk to your son, and the pictures really were like from the 1950s, but it was, it was very sweet. So we had it set up. So like I talked to our daughters and my husband would talk to our sons, and, and I think that's nice in theory, but in general, really, our boys kind of figured it out because our daughters, they shared a bathroom with our daughters who were not the most sanitary. We eventually remodeled our house, and we had the girls' bedrooms upstairs and the boys' bedrooms downstairs. And the girls, as a matter of fact, we put we still have it up there. I found a, like one of those women placards for the bathroom.
Oh,
so
yeah.
that's for the upstairs bathroom. It's like boys should not enter this space. It's not just for the period products, but it's also makeup and this all. Our girls' bathroom was always much dirtier, messier than the boys.
Yeah, common misconception.
It is a common, the boys is just, easy to clean up after, but.
Yeah, because I had brought my mom on the show, and we had talked about that, and I had asked her if she had any advice for me, for future children that I have. She goes, "Oh, make sure you talk to your sons too as well as your daughters."
That's a good. Yeah, that's a good.
But that's totally true. Is that there isn't like a handbook.
There's not, and I think it's like here's when you're supposed to do it, but by the time I and there's little parts that, sort of gradually talk them into it. By the time I really sat my daughter down to the oldest one that you met, who's an orthopedic surgeon now. So when I first sat her down at probably, 13 or something, to let's really talk about, okay, here's what we're talking about how to, and it had only been a year. My husband was deployed the year before that. And so when she was 12, and at one point during the deployment, so Laura was the oldest and the youngest was probably 2 or 3. And she was like, the kids, once the youngest got to be that age, the kids would all start begging, like, when are we going to have another baby, Mom? We need to have. So, and so she said to me, and she was 12, and she was like, Mom, when are you going to have another baby? And I was like, well, we can't have another baby because Dad's gone. Can't have another baby. And she said, well, can't you at least get started? I was like, oh, it's inappropriate time right now, but note to self, we need to have a talk.
It's like, there's an episode of the Rugrats where Angelica, I think it tells the rest of the babies that if they eat a watermelon with a seed, that's how that happened.
Oh, okay.
So that would have been mine. Yeah. It's like, well, your dad left all the watermelon, so I can't really.
Yeah.
I could go buy as much watermelon as I want at the store, but Dad's not here, so.
Yeah, so at that point I was like, okay, I got to find a time to talk to her. And it might have not been a whole year. It might have been 6 months later or something. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, get the time right. And I don't know why I built these things up in my head, but sort of pluses and minuses of being young while you have your kids. I think it's mostly pluses, but that's maybe because that's how we did it. But then when I sat her down to go talk about it, she's like, Mom, I read medical books. I know that was so she's like, yeah, I got this. So she's like, I know how. So she had, and it was during that time that she started getting really interested. And as a matter of fact, that's why we, I say we homeschooled them up to high school and then beyond, not beyond, but initially I just figured, well, we'll just keep homeschooling them until, I don't know. But her level of interest and ability in science was far outstripping my level of ability and certainly my level of interest. So that's why we decided to make the break then. But so she got ahead of me.
Wow. But I think that's neat that because I could see that the difficulty in having that conversation comes with like wanting to keep the innocence of being a child.
Exactly, right.
And the fact that she's already like was coming from like a medical background or a science background. Yeah. It's like, oh, okay, well you're not gonna, you don't have to tell the other things that come with this, but it's like you get it.
Yeah, and it took me by surprise because literally not very much earlier she had no clue, but she's a fast reader, so she figured it all out in between. But yeah, that's awesome. And I'm just much more conceptual and I don't know. So yeah. But I would do it. Probably most parents say that. Like now, I would really know how to do that. Like I think like, okay, now I know how to homeschool my kids. Now that I've already done it. Like, okay, boy, if we could, and maybe that's the cool thing. That's our first grandchild is due May 15th, actually.
Oh,
so soon. So maybe that we hear from all our friends that are grandparents that like, oh, it's just the best thing ever. So maybe that's you get to sort of like do over.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, none of my siblings none of us are obviously having kids or anything,
Mm-hmm.
but my mom has had like friends who've had their little kids and will like spoil them and didn't
Mm-hmm.
spoil us. So,
yeah.
Like, oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah, let's see where this is going.
Yeah, you're because you couldn't, now you can.
Right. Yeah.
But kind of getting into so let me do a little backstory for listeners. Is that I was taking your class
Mm-hmm.
a few weeks ago, and we got on the topic of consent. And I think it's it's a relevant discussion that's happening right now. It's even being talked about in sex education within schools, which, I mean, your daughter was advanced enough in homeschool that she
Mm-hmm.
didn't, skip that whole conversation and, y'all handled it yourselves. But I guess the question getting into it is that do you think that society has any sort of like do you think the discussion on consent has been constructive just from like a societal standpoint, or do you think that there's maybe like a lot that people don't know about what consent means?
Yeah, so it's what we're talking about, and we talked about both in
Yes,
class,
correct.
right?
Yeah.
So the class that this was marriage and family life class, obviously in the context of Catholic theology. So it's really the theology of marriage. So, and people always have a lot of questions, and I knew obviously there would be a lot of questions going into the class about annulments, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which some people just see as like Catholic divorce. But so it's an important, so what annulment though is saying is that the marriage never existed, right? It's the church doesn't make it have not existed. It's just a declaration of nullity, they call. And what they really look for in annulments, I don't know if this is too much backstory, but if
fine.
what they when we're going through, when the tribunal is what they call it, that looks at annulment cases, what they're looking at is consent. Is that when the couple got married, did they understand what they were doing? Did they understand the import of what a Christian marriage is? And did they both come in with full consent? So in like an example of where you would not have full consent, and this is the aspect of consent we're talking about for Catholic theology, the marriage, theology of marriage. If a couple has, say, the woman is pregnant, and they had been dating for a while, but had not decided whether or not they were going to get married, but now she's pregnant, so now there's pressure on them. They've got some decisions to make. Is she going to keep the baby? Are they going to, is she going to really, actually, the first thing nowadays would be, is she going to continue with the pregnancy, mm-hmm. right? And then is she going to keep the baby, or is there going to be an adoption? Or if they rule those things out, then, now what? Are we going to get married? Or, there's this child there that you have to deal with. And then it's like, well, we were probably going to get married anyway. So then the question, though, becomes, are they getting married because they feel the pressure of the baby that's come in? And once you have that, then the question becomes, are they really giving their full consent? And you can't say just by the situation. It could be that a couple in that situation does give their full consent, and maybe the baby there helps them to realize, like, no, I want to be. And there's two aspects to this that we talked about in class. You need to give full consent to understanding what as we would say in Catholic theology, this vocation of marriage that you're submitting yourself to, mm-hmm. for the rest of your life, to be faithful to this one person for the rest of your life, and all that marriage entails. So you're consenting to that state of life, for one, but then you're also consenting to this particular person as they are really on the day, as everything that you know about them on that day that you're getting married. So it's not about what happens 10 years after marriage. It's about what happens the day that you get married. This is a sort of a brief way of looking at consent. And consent is what makes the marriage in Catholic theology. Not just Catholic theology, actually, that it actually comes from, originated in some sense, at least in the Roman Empire, and probably in other places as well. But consent is an important concept to understand in Catholic theology, and it's really the only way you're going to understand annulment. And it's also very, I think, often misrepresented. And there is a big emphasis in marriage preparation on love, which is good, right? And on how to sustain the love, and lots of really great information on how to deal with situations as they come up, which is really good. And I think the church has a long way to go, but I know the church is doing a lot more than actually the Catholic Church is doing more than most churches do. Most churches don't have a whole lot of marriage preparation. And nowadays, when we have a culture of not very stable marriages, family life, it's becoming less stable. This is becoming more and more important. So that's what we're talking about with consent. But it's not all that dissimilar to what we're talking about in this Me Too movement of consent. And I brought up in class, although I didn't show the video of that. Is this a widely enough known video of that?
Yes,
yeah. So the T, which I just love.
Yeah.
I just think it's very funny, but it gets the point across very well. If somebody is unconscious, they no longer want tea.
Yeah.
And it's okay if they initially said they wanted tea, and then you go to the trouble of boiling the water and getting it all prepped, and then you bring it out and they no longer want tea. That's okay. They no longer want tea. So this is a long way of answering your question. So it's not the same thing as what we're talking about in class, but there are overlapping themes, obviously.
Yeah, because I was going to at least like trying to take that understanding of full consent and applying it to like a secular context.
Yeah.
Is that it seems like that they
right.
seem or they correlate.
Yeah. So, and then it becomes, so is this Me Too movement a good thing? Personally, I like dialogue. I like debate. I mean, from the class, right? And I very much like encouraging debate. So while I'm happy to be the one debating, I also like in the class to encourage the students to really engage with each other and not just constantly hear my voice. So I think the Me Too movement is good in that way, is that it opens up the dialogue, and I think that it moves beyond sort of preconceptions, because if you think a certain way, you just will obviously presume that other people think that way, right? Until you have this conversation, you're like, oh, wow, you're not coming with the same, what seems to me, obvious preconception.
Right.
So in that sense, I think that it can be helpful. Obviously, there's some aspects where it becomes so much, if it's not grounded, if concepts are not grounded in any sort of truth, though, then there can be a tendency of just having the conversation become unmoored. So there's I'd say it's a positive thing, but it needs to be overseen, or overseen is probably not the right word. It needs to be there still needs to be treaded carefully, I would say.
Yeah, or just your intention.
Because then, some of there's gray areas in there. I mean, we can easily go to that if somebody's unconscious, that's not consent. That seems obvious. But, what happens when you get to other areas where it's not quite so, maybe it's this teasing, flirtatious kind of thing that's part of somebody's style. I don't know. You can get into some gray areas, I would say. So it's but I think the conversation is interesting. I would think as men, for some men, it probably makes them like, unless I have a written statement, I should just assume no. It's probably how some men feel, and that's probably going too far the other way. But
I would say that, I would rather be that than the opposite.
Obviously,
right?
Yeah.
Where it's like if you always assume that the answer is no, then you're not more likely. Yeah. You're not likely to make someone else feel uncomfortable. Yeah. I guess, but yeah. I think I've never heard anybody actually say that before, or say that they've heard most men say that that's how they think. I feel, at least maybe it's just my generation of guys that I've dealt with, where it's never been that. It's been the opposite.
If I said that I think most men think that, I don't mean to say that most men think that, because I have no idea what most men think. But yes. that if there's a what I should say is that the concern that I would have is this fear of saying and doing the wrong thing, when they intend well. I don't have a problem with Joe Biden being given a hard time right now, because to me it seems obvious. Don't sniff a woman's hair. Like, when is that?
Yeah, you're right.
I don't know, when is that ever going to be appropriate, right? But what if he touches their arm, right? It's nice to see you, and it's a gentle pat of your arm or something. Well, that can be, I could see where as a woman that could be sort of patronizing. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not a young child. I'm, so whereas, maybe they don't mean any harm by that. I think that it's most of the stuff they're talking about in the Me Too movement are not gentle pats on the arm.
Sure.
Or even the Joe Biden stuff. It's more the, certainly the extreme cases that we've seen, and I don't even know how extreme they are, but the Harvey Weinstein and by extreme I don't know how they might be very common. So that's obviously we want to do away with that. The thing that I really like about that I think the Me Too movement has brought up is it's about this imbalance of power that you have with that case. So when you have in the case that they were bringing up, an actress and a director or producer, I don't even know what he was, but somebody who can really influence you, or obviously clergy. That's the really horrible thing about the clergy sex abuse scandal, is this imbalance of power. You see this in work areas. You have it in all sorts of things like that what might seem like consent is this is where it relates to the Catholic part, is that their consent is really limited because it's at least limited in a sense because of this imbalance of power. So when we look at, I don't know, like Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton, when you're a young woman and it's the president of the United States, is that full consent? There's a lot that goes into that. So an argument could be made that, well, that's not really full consent. But if you are the man in power, or the person in power, I should say, and you're not really being sensitive to that, and it looks like full consent to you, so it becomes, unless we have this dialogue where who's somebody who's in a position of authority or power can realize that, like, oh, because of my position, I have to be thinking of this. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up like clergy, because I think that's super relevant right now.
It's incredibly relevant, right? So even when you have the case of, two, we're not, obviously when you're talking about minors, that's a whole, you're in a whole different criminal activity.
Mm-hmm.
But just we had a case in San Diego a couple of years ago with a young priest, and he had a relationship with this woman who had been his girlfriend, I think, prior to going into seminary. They're the same age, they had this prior relationship, and they continued it afterwards. Now, so on one level, this is completely different from the clergy sex abuse thing, but of course he's been defrocked and all of that because he brought the liturgy into their sexual dalliances, which is completely over the line. Yeah. But the argument that she made was that because he was clergy, it was, well, as I understood the argument, there was this inherent, imbalance of power. And that's a really interesting case because they had started, he wasn't ordained, and it was really, you'd think of it as an equal sort of thing. So
yeah,
I think it's an interesting.
And do you think that like this definition of like marital consent, which we've kind of like applied to this conversation, that the societal, like the definition outside of the church and then the definition of marital consent, can they be like just one and the same? Is it the same?
I don't think that they can be one and the same, but because there's more to the concept, I think, but there's an awful lot of overlap,
Yeah. And then do you think, so then how would we, I guess, bring more awareness to what marital consent is, either in differentiating from the societal definition or how the concepts, like kind of you were using around like imbalancing of power, like how can we show that it also applies to like a society, or that it's something that someone who's not a religious person can maybe understand or implement? That's my favorite question.
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not involved in the marriage preparation for the diocese here, but if I were, I think I would do I would use the consent issue, because secular people come in for Catholic marriage all the time because they just are like, well, we should get married in the church, so I guess we'll get married in the church. And so it's a good opportunity to bring people in and kind of teach them, about what this whole thing is about. And I think using the modern understanding of consent and building upon that, like, what this is, so let's show you how when we apply it to Catholic marriage, this is what we're talking about. And so they're very related. They're very related in that way, in the same way that St. Paul does in the book of Acts. When he's at Athens and he says, do you see these? You see this, statue to your unknown God. Well, let me just tell you who it is you're praying to. So he takes what they know, right? This pagan God, this, and he sort of fills in the blanks with Christianity, right? So I like how he doesn't totally reject this. He just meets them where they are, and he sort of brings them.
No, I think that's a great phrase of saying meet them where they are. Because I think, in that, obviously that's what he's doing, but I think that more religious people are called to do that, is meet somebody where they're at. Because I feel like I see like a lot of religious people that want to just change them and will make you exactly like me, and it's very forceful. but it's not trying to get on that person's level of like how you're already doing what is already taught here or whatever. Like
our former bishop, our bishop emeritus now in San Diego, Bishop Robert Brom, he's from, I guess he's from the Midwest, and he's a big baseball fan. And I might have told you this in class, but he talked about being this 6-year-old kid or whatever, going to play baseball and didn't know how to play baseball, but now he's old enough to go with the boys to the neighborhood park. And so these pickup games, what they do is he'd go with his little baseball glove and he'd just show up at the field, and then they put him in right field, and then they just play the game, right? And then eventually he picks it up as he goes along, and so pretty much then he knows it all. But he was saying what didn't happen to him is when he showed up, that they didn't say, okay, little kid, do you know the infield fly rule? Do you understand, all this, all these the intricacies that are essential to baseball? You need to have the infield fly rule. Otherwise, people will try to take advantage of the situation and get a double play where there should only be one out, right? So I'm a big proponent of the infield fly rule. But, people don't necessarily have to know that to be welcomed into the fold. But the intent is you eventually train them up in that way. Mm. So Pope Francis uses the field hospital for the sick or whatever. That's what that's what this is, and that's a good way. Obviously, it's a good way of looking at this. But what you don't do is you don't sort of like put up paintings and make the field hospital the permanent solution. Yeah. What your thing is, you've got to bring them through the field hospital and then into the more permanent of the. You don't want people to stay in the field hospital, right? Yeah. It should be moving towards something else. So I think it's a both and. So obviously, I'm a very observant Catholic. I wouldn't say that we sort of bend the rules to accommodate other people, mm-hmm. but there needs to be a way to bring people in to meet you. I mean, we see Jesus does that, meet people where they are, and then this Sunday is going to be the woman caught in adultery, the Sunday reading. So that really, that's a great example of Jesus meeting her there, but then also saying, go and sin no more.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think that was a really nice way to just put everything together. That was very academic. Did you have any final thoughts about our discussion that was not covered in this nice little wrap-up you did?
No, I mean, we could obviously just keep talking about this for hours on end, but no, I think it's good to talk about these things. So I applaud you, what you're doing. I think it's great. So.
Yeah, and it's good that we're bringing everybody is talking about it, and I think that's the most important thing is that dialogue is happening,
right?
And because that's going to lead to something,
right?
And then, which is what you already talked about with what Me Too's doing, and then like what this religious conversation is doing, and like how it's just we all can get along. Let's just all talk about it. That's fine.
Exactly.
But do you have any any academic writings that we could find, or any places we can see you, or putting you on the spot?
Well, yeah, you can pretty much find me nowhere.
Which is fine. People are that way.
Yeah. So I've been we've been pretty much heads down focused on. We're super involved in our church, and what I've been really focused on doing is decreasing my online presence. And right now, just in a period of life where we're trying to reconnect with people in the moment. And I'm trying to purposely focus on meeting people for coffee more, engaging more. Not that I'm against all the other things.
Yeah.
It's just, you go through these phases in your life. So there might be a particular phase where I would want to do that, some sort of writings and such. This is something that my husband and I have definitely battered around for quite some time. But right now, at this moment, I haven't even been logging on to Facebook. So
wow.
It's just where I am right now.
No, that's great. That you can unplug a little bit. Mm-hmm. That's really cool. Well, that's fine. We'll just listen to this episode on repeat. That's fine. I haven't unplugged yet, so if listeners want to, if there's any, can I send listeners your way if I get questions or anything? If they email me.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Great. So if you guys have any thoughts or discussions on what we talked about, you can email me and I'll forward it over.
And arguments, I'm happy to have arguments.
Yes, there we go.
That was crazy. Why did she say that?
Yeah. Yes, please, you are invited to debate.
That's right. Because I probably did say it wrong.
But yeah, send your debate, your thoughts, whatever, tampa talkwithmary@gmail.com. You can follow us on Instagram, on Twitter. We're Tampa Talk WMary on there. You can like us on Facebook. We're really plugged in. We're very in there. But find us on there. And please, dialogue. It's what needs to happen. I promise I'm not drunk. This is where I'm at in the afternoon today. Thank you for listening. And if you are a bleeder, keep on bleeding. It's going to be okay. If you are someone who's not, have empathy for one that does. And we all should be having a dialogue. Talk to somebody today. That's my 2 cents. So we'll see you next time on Tampa Talk with Mary.